I'm joined tonight by historian and former professor Dr. E. Michael Jones. Dr. Jones is the editor of Culture Wars magazine and the author of several books, including The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on World History. His most recent book is Bare Metal: A History of Capitalism as the Conflict Between Labor and Usury. Tonight, I want to discuss his other book, which is Libido Dominandi. In that book, he provides a perspective on pornography, its political impact, its political use, and the role Hollywood has played in the sexualizing and degrading of American culture. Of course, time permitting, I might want to get into some of the other works. But Dr. Jones, in Libido Dominandi, you present the thesis that the preaching or the advancement of so-called sexual freedom or sexual liberty is actually a tool to impose political control.
Yes.
Can you go into that?
Well, there are a number of different ways to go into it, but the one talk I've given all over the world is that begins with talking about the Israelis invading Ramallah in I believe it was 2002, 2003. Anyway, the first thing they did was take over the TV stations, and the second thing they did was start broadcasting pornography over these TV stations. Now the question is, why would they do that? And if you're an American, you would have to say, well, because pornography means freedom, because that's what Americans believe. We have two Hollywood movies testifying to that fact: Boogie Nights and The People versus Larry Flynn. And the latter film has Larry Flynn saying explicitly in a courtroom scene, "No one's free unless I'm free to broadcast pornography." So if that's the case, if that's true, then we have to believe that the Israelis want to bring liberation to the Palestinians. Well, that's preposterous. We know that the Palestinians want to conquer and subjugate the Palestinians. They'd like to exterminate them if they could. But the preliminary to that was occupying their land and trying to demoralize them. And that's why they broadcast pornography. So the conclusion we have to draw from this is that no, pornography is not a form of freedom. It's a form of covert warfare. It's also a form of political control. And from there, I often go and talk about the whole battle in the United States over obscenity, the battle between the Catholic Church, and the Jews that took place in the 1930s when Hollywood uh, uh, had gotten into a serious financial situation. Before they got into that, I'm referring to 1929 when they had to borrow a lot of money to finance talking pictures. And at that point, they were in debt. And then at that point, the stock market crashed. And at that point, people stopped going to movies. And so they were in trouble. Now, the church at this point simply took up the slack that the Protestants had taken up before them in the 1920s. Because during the 1920s, when Hollywood films became more and more part of our culture, everyone was upset at the sexualization of the culture that they were promoting. We tend to we first of all we don't even know what they were doing, but there was a lot of nudity in the films. There was promotion of homosexuality even back then, and also ridicule of the clergy, blasphemy, things like that. And everyone was upset. The Protestants tried and lost their nerve and failed, and then the Catholics stepped up to the plate, and they created the Legion of Decency. And the Legion of Decency threatened the Jews in Hollywood with a boycott. And when the Jews didn't back down, the boycott started. It began in Philadelphia, where I grew up. Cardinal Doherty called a boycott of Warner Brothers theaters in Philadelphia. And by the time it kicked into action, Harry Warner was losing $100,000 a week in Philadelphia. And at this point, the rest of the Catholic hierarchy, which was united behind Cardinal Doherty and united in his promotion of the Legion of Decency, um, threatened to follow suit. So that would mean that every Catholic in every big city in America would stop going to the movies, and that would have meant the financial ruin of Hollywood. So at that point, the Jews in Hollywood caved in. They instituted the production code. And for 31 years, there was no nudity in films, no obscenity, no promotion of homosexuality, no ridicule of the clergy, and so on and so forth. And everybody went to the movies. You know, they didn't have to. They had plenty of money. Everybody was happy. But after about 31 years, the situation changed. In 29, the Catholics were strong and the Jews were weak. In 65, the Jews were strong and the Catholics were weak. And the main reason the Catholics were weak was because of the Second Vatican Council. Not that there was anything wrong with the documents of the Second Vatican Council, but the publicity surrounding the council was totally in the control of the CIA and its propaganda ministry, which was basically Time magazine. We have a book coming out on this, which will expose the whole connection between John Courtney Murray, the CIA, and Time Life. It's a very important book, but precisely because of this disinformation campaign that the CIA and Time Life conducted, Catholics were totally confused, didn't know what was going to happen. Are they going to approve birth control? Is birth control okay? Are we going to, I don't know, is it going to be 7 commandments instead of 10? Who knows? Everything was up for grabs at that point. At least that's the impression you got from reading Time magazine. And so the Catholics couldn't really enforce the code anymore. And so the Jews sensed their moment of opportunity, and they floated a Holocaust film, which had become their sacred cause in the meantime. Huge difference between 1933 and 1965. The Jews now had the upper hand because of the Holocaust. And so they floated a Holocaust film called The Pawnbroker, which starred Rod Steiger. But the whole point of this is to use the Holocaust as a front, as a way of smuggling what they're really interested in, which is bare breasts. So there's a black prostitute who bares her breast in the middle of this film. That breaks the code. That means that the Catholics, all right, have to go to the barricades again, declare a boycott, and so on and so forth, and it doesn't happen. And so as a result, the Jews got away with breaking the code. They destroyed, in doing that, they broke whatever restraints were on them in terms of portraying, in terms of controlling discourse in the United States, basically. That's what it came down to. The Jews now had no one controlling them, and then they just went to the point where they have now, which is a total monopoly on the media, the public media. And so I would say that there's a direct line from the breaking the code in 65, then to the mainstreaming of pornography, which took place in 1973. 3 of the top grossing films in 1973 were hardcore pornography. The theater, the movie theater, was the vehicle for pornography at this period of time. And so you had The Devil and Miss Jones, Deep Throat, and Behind the Green Door. 3 pornographic films being shown at first-run movie theaters around the United States. Pornography is always a function of technology. The technology has changed since then. It went from first-run theaters to VHS, and now it's obviously on the internet. But at that moment in time, it was first-run theaters. And once they mainstreamed pornography, they used it as a form of control. The first opponent, the first victim of this form of control was the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church lost its control over the mind of its own people, largely because of pornography, but also because of the other things that I mentioned. And once that took place, basically we had a change in America. So I would say, so 73, we got hardcore pornography. 78, 76, Woody Allen is now on the cover of Time magazine as an American genius. 78, Nelson Rockefeller and John D. Rockefeller both die in the same year. These were the leaders. The Rockefeller family was in many ways the leaders of the WASP ruling class. What you have at this point is a changing of the guard from the WASP ruling class to what we have now, which is basically a Jewish ruling class. These are the people that control discourse now. The WASP sort of went out of existence because of their birth control campaign. They failed to reproduce. And so the Jews took over, and that's where it stands now. And there, when George Bush, the second, became president, they took over foreign policy, and they inaugurated the war against Islam, which is basically the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We're still bogged down in that mess, and we have seen no way out of this mess as of now, as far as I can tell. So that, in my short summary here, is basically the whole story of how sexual liberation became a form of political control, who did it, who won, and who lost.
Now, you have different phases in this psychological warfare operation throughout I guess, from the 30s to the second decade of the 21st century. First, you have the WASP elite versus the Catholics, correct?
Right.
And then you have.
I usually preface any talk I give by saying that in America, in order to understand America, you have to understand a sociological theory called the triple melting pot, which is basically when people come from all over the world to become Americans, they don't just become generic Americans. They become one of three kinds of Americans: Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. In America, country of origin ceases to be significant as an ethnic designator after the third generation. After the third generation, your ethnic identity is basically your religion. And so America is like Yugoslavia in that regard. Mm-hmm. Three religious groups fighting with each other in a kind of covert cultural warfare to see who can dominate the culture and take it over. So to get back to what you said, yes, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was very definitely a WASP ruling class that basically ran the culture. And over this period of time, they brought the Jews in. They brought in people like Eddie Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, father of public relations, had a big influence. Walter Lippmann, another influential Jew at this point. And gradually the Jews became so influential that they took over the culture. And so if you have like an institution like Harvard now is dominated by Jews rather than the WASP who created it at that time. So yes, that's what I'm talking about. I think it's important to understand just who is fighting here, who's doing the battling here, and what they believe.
And maybe for a point of clarification or explanation is when you're talking about sexual freedom, the message of sexual freedom, or as a method of political control, there's a process here. It's basically by peddling pornography, right, exposing people to pornography, it leaves people open to manipulation, and it exploits their passions. And
right.
And when they allow their passions to be exploited, or they become a slave to their passions and their desires, the people peddling or producing that pornography gain a measure of control over those people's psychology, and hence
yes.
they can be controlled. That's the manipulation.
This is classic Christian teaching. It goes all the way back to the beginning of Christianity. It's in the gospel, the slave of sin. St. Augustine codified it, or said it explicitly in the City of God. He said, a man has as many masters as he has vices, because we are a rational creature. And the only thing that allows us to retain our identity is the use of reason. And if we allow passion to override reason, we are no longer rational creatures. And the people who control the stimuli then control us. And they know that, our opponents know that. And that's why they are so determined to have total control over our culture. And I wish the Catholics knew it as well as their opponents in the culture wars, but they don't. There's no one, to paraphrase H.L. Mencken, no one ever went broke underestimating the intelligence of an American Catholic. And so unfortunately, at the same time, this also gets into my book, Slaughter of Cities, but after World War II, you have this dual war going on there. The CIA is working on its doctrinal warfare program. The WASP ruling class at this point is very concerned about Catholic fertility because they're using birth control and the Catholics are not. But at the same time, they're telling the Catholics, oh, we want you to be sitting at the table. All you have to do is make a few minor adjustments and everything will be fine. Well, the Catholics were stupid enough to go along with that, also aided by the anti-communist crusade. The Catholics were all against communism, and so therefore they wanted to work on the side of the Americans who declared that they were against communism too. So they got hornswoggled, basically. And they got sucked into a deal that was a crooked deal. And now we're just coming to see who the dealers were. Like John Courtney Murray was an extremely significant figure in this regard. But there were other people as well. Father Theodore Hesburgh, who just died a few months ago. A notorious compromiser worked hand in glove with the Rockefellers. Even in 1965, he organized a private audience between John D. Rockefeller III and Paul VI, at which John D. Rockefeller volunteered to write what eventually came out as Humanae Vitae. This shows you this kind of craven collaboration on the part of the Catholics across the board. And unfortunately, I think it's still the case. They still have a bad case of Stockholm syndrome, except that America is their captor. America has captured them. America is holding them hostage, and they've fallen in love with their captors. That's the problem.
And of course, not of course, but Ted Hesburgh, he was the one who gave the keys of Notre Dame over to the Rockefeller Foundation, correct?
Well, I mean, he stole the University of Notre Dame from the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
They called it the Land O'Lakes Statement, where he placed the university under a lay board of trustees. This is not my idea. I was the official biography of Cardinal Kroll of Philadelphia, and I asked him what he thought of the Land O'Lakes Statement, and he, who was the man in charge of revising the Code of Canon Law, and so no stranger to the concepts of canon law, said it was alienation of church property. So once the property was alienated, then Hesburgh did whatever he could to align the goals of the university with, first, the Rockefellers and all of the private foundations that were the main funders of higher education at that point, and then with the federal government that basically took over the role of the big foundations in terms of funding their subversive programs.
So instead of protecting Notre Dame's unique status as a Catholic university or a unique institution, he was more interested in money and prestige.
Yes,
yeah.
That's right. And he was rewarded by being given 150 honorary doctorates, more than any person in the history of the universe, as according to the Guinness Book of World Records. So all I can say in that regard is beware when all speak well of you.
Yes, the people who are popular you got to worry about. Yeah. So looking at pornography, what you presented here, and what I tend to agree is it's a very sophisticated but very subtle form of psychological warfare. It's it's the old devil's trick of providing something that's initially pleasing but then leads to your destruction.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Now it does kind of get to your Slaughter of Cities book, because the method by which when you lay out basically what it was Catholics versus the Protestants, Catholics versus the Jews. And when we say Jews, we're talking about organized Jews, Hollywood, the elite.
Jewish people is what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You invariably get in trouble if you criticize Jews. You're automatically called an anti-Semite. Yeah. I am talking about the Jewish people. They have been organized for their entire history. Mm-hmm. The organization used to be known as the Sanhedrin. Now it's Major Jewish Organizations. Whatever it is, doesn't mean that every single Jew goes along with the agenda of the Jewish people.
Yes,
okay?
Course, yeah.
I need to make that clear. There are many Jews who support my work. Mm-hmm. Some of them have become Catholics at my suggestion, which I think is, what they should do. Some of them have not become Catholics. So to say that all Jews agree with this is wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the Jewish people. The Jewish people. That is
Well,
the political entity I'm talking about. It was the Jewish people that killed Jesus Christ back then. The Jewish people said his blood be on us and our people. The Jewish people chose Barabbas, and in choosing him, they became revolutionaries, and they've been revolutionaries ever since. Okay?
as an organized, yeah. Well, it's almost like when you say the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
Absolutely. That's exactly the analogy that I've used. Does
I'm not
that mean
saying
every
all seven.
Japanese
Yeah,
person was in that airplane
yeah,
or agreed? No, I'm not saying that. But there is an entity called the Japanese people, and they did bomb Pearl Harbor.
yeah. So that's it's again, words matter, and part of the play on words is part of the mind control that they tend to control the debate that way. Whether you any criticism waged against them is interpreted as some sort of anti-Semitism
Yeah.
or bigotry when it's just it's
And in a sense, everything I'm saying on this topic is aimed primarily at the Jews who are slowly waking up to the fact that they're in a bad operation. They're being held hostage by a group of people who do not have their best interest in mind. And that has been the case ever since the death of Jesus Christ. The Talmud is a book that was created to keep Jews away from Logos, away from the incarnate Logos, Jesus Christ. And nothing has changed in this regard. So, in many ways, everything I'm saying is aimed at those Jews who feel that there's something missing, that they're in a bad operation, that they're constantly being manipulated by these people. Their fears are being cultivated, and they're being controlled.
and,
So I'm saying there's a way out.
and that tactic or that approach informed the Zionist movement, correct?
Absolutely. IPAC is notorious for pandering, for exacerbating the fears of the Jewish people. They have a conference every year, and it's always as if who's the new Hitler? It was Ahmadinejad, Mr. Ahmadinejad for a while. I don't know who it is now. I'm probably the new Hitler for all I know. But there's always some guy that gets
Yeah.
flashed on the screen to scare the hell out of the Jews so that they cough up money for IPAC and keep this whole scam going. So I said this in Iran. I was in Iran. People invited me there. I gave a speech. I said, look, fear is useless. What is needed is love. I'm saying the same thing to the Jews. You can come out of that intellectual ghetto. You can be free. And the
Yeah,
man
yeah.
who's going to free you is the Messiah you've been waiting for. It's Jesus Christ.
In a sense, you're arguing for true assimilation as opposed to I guess you could say the Zionists who want the separate state separate
Yes,
and
I'm
always
I'm
yeah,
arguing for the liberation of the Jewish
yeah.
people. That's my goal in life.
Now, uh, so we have the Protestants versus the Catholics, and what the Protestants were upset with was what they called differential fertility because the Catholics weren't contracepting, and the Protestants were. And I think in 1929, when the Anglican Church embraced contraception,
Right.
and so basically you're looking at a demographic problem.
That's right.
And so demography is destiny, or at least political power. Much of political power derives from demography.
Absolutely.
So Catholic Church, circa 30s and 40s, is deriving much of its political power, much of its cultural power, more importantly, and moral authority from these urban neighborhoods, these condensed or homogenous
No, it's not
Italian.
deriving. It's not deriving its moral power.
Oh,
It's
I'm
deriving
sorry. Yeah,
its political power. Its
political.
political power
Yeah,
is based on that demographic increase that
yeah.
that kicked off, especially after World War II. It was called the baby boom. It was
The
mostly
baby
a
boom. Yeah.
Catholic phenomenon.
So you have that, and so a strategy, and this is I get this from Libido Dominandi and also from your Slaughter of Cities, was to intentionally break up these neighborhoods so there'd be sort of a diaspora, so to speak,
Right.
and the more capable, more talented, skillful would leave the cities and go into the suburbs and become deracinated, lose their Catholic identity, and
Right.
become Americans and
Middle
kind of
class.
middle class.
If you lived in Chicago, you were Polish or Italian.
Yeah.
But as soon as you moved to Park Forest or someplace like that, you became middle class.
And this is your example. Was the first town was Levittown,
Right,
which
in
was
New
originally
York.
was a government operation, right? It was like a pseudo World War
Well,
II housing issue or something.
they learned the Levitt brothers learned their technique as Seabees during World War II,
Oh, okay, yeah,
and they just brought that to bear in producing mass amounts of housing. I mean, you had a huge housing shortage at this point. You had, what was it, 11 million men coming back from the war,
Yeah.
and nothing had been built since pretty much since the Depression. So there's a huge demand, and so they just used these industrial techniques that had been perfected during the war. But it became then the vehicle for social engineering.
Hmm.
And they were very clear about that. If you read that book that supposedly was written by Gunnar Myrdal, uh, The
The American
American
Dilemma.
Dilemma, he talks very openly about social engineering. We need social engineering at this point. And that's what they got. That's what we got, especially we Catholics. We got social engineering, and nobody knew it. Nobody knew it was happening. Nobody told us. So to get back to my family, I was born 1948. We lived in an Irish neighborhood in North Philadelphia. Uh, and then the black people crossed Lehigh Avenue. So what you had here was the carrot and the stick. The carrot was the FHA mortgages, these low percentage mortgages for houses in the suburb, and the stick was black migration. Basically, the government brought black people up and then flooded them into, deliberately put them into Catholic ethnic neighborhoods. The example I give specifically was the St. Louis the King Parish in Detroit, where the pastor objected to, there's plenty of room in Detroit. It's a big place. It's not like an island like Manhattan, plenty of room. They could have built the projects anywhere they wanted, but they deliberately built them in a Polish neighborhood because they didn't like Poles, because the Poles were Catholic. Because they were Catholic, they couldn't be trusted. And so therefore, the government, I'm talking now Louis Wirth, who said this specifically. He was a sociologist from University of Chicago, said that these people couldn't be trusted because of their origin. And so he killed two birds with one stone. Break up the ethnic neighborhoods and provide a beachhead for the black people, the sharecroppers from the South, who then would be basically a revolutionary movement, which would be totally disruptive of law and order, and they would continue this way all the way up through the 60s. They were promoted as what Marx would call the lumpen proletariat. In other words, they would engage in criminal activity. They would not be punished. The gangs, the black gangs that formed practically automatically after the dislocation of moving from places like Mississippi to places like Chicago because of the uprootedness, the federal government actually supported these criminal gangs. The Sergeant Shriver, I mentioned this in Slaughter of Cities, Sergeant Shriver gave the Blackstone Rangers close to $1 million. Well, they knew, this came out in the church hearings in 1976, the Office of Economic Opportunity knew they were engaged in criminal activity, and they gave them the money anyway because they wanted them to engage in criminal activity, because this made it intolerable for the white people, the Catholic ethnics, who were called white people at that time. And so they would move, and that would be fulfill the social engineering plans for the Catholics.
And so the whole notion of suburbia was a social engineering operation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, in order to get to suburbia, you had to have a car. And in order to get to, you had to have roads. And so the whole program of social engineering revolved around getting people out of cities and moving them into suburbs.
I found a quote in Slaughter of Cities, I think by Bill Kaufman, he provided, where he says, "The invisible hand did not build the federal highway system."
No.
Yeah, and so
This
it
is
was.
one of these.
Yeah,
This is one of these preposterous fictions that our libertarian friends come up with. That it was all just the market. Well, that's crazy. It was not the market. It was the government, the heavy hand of government, without which the interstate highway system could not have been built. And what was it built for? It was built to move people into places where they could be controlled more easily. So you couldn't sit on your front step and talk to your neighbor across the street because the streets were too wide and you had to mow your lawn or something like that. And even those, and at that point, you also had the rise of television. And so what were these good Catholics doing that wanted to be good Americans? They drive to work, then they drive home, and then they'd sit in front of a TV screen, and then they'd fall asleep. And they get up and do the same thing the next day. It was totally isolating, totally alien to man's social nature, and also totally destructive of Catholic identity.
And this gets into how you discuss how these like the Bauhaus movement, the Grotius, was it
Gropius, Walter
Gropius,
Gropius.
Gropius, how he believed if you provide the architecture, you could change human nature. Correct? That's the idea.
Uh, y- yes, I
Yeah.
mean basically a Bauhaus. Bauhaus was for Negroes. Okay, the white people had houses in the suburbs, but the projects were all Bauhaus buildings. I went into the Robert Taylor homes when I did my book Living Machines. First white guy probably in the Robert Taylor home since the last builder, kind of turned the light switch off when he left.
That was in Chicago.
That was in
Yeah.
Chicago, and it was a very dangerous place. I fortunately had a friend who was a social worker, and she explained to me that if I went early in the morning, it would be safe. Nobody's up, and that's what we did. We went into the Robert Taylor homes, walked around, got in the elevator, went up, got doors stuck. Here we are. I thought we're stuck in the elevator. I have to grab the door, pull it open, and there's a guy with his beeper and his gold chains, with the most shocked look on his face I've ever seen. What's this white guy doing in the Robert Taylor homes? So then I just introduce myself, and we walk in, and there's his wife, or I don't know who it is. A lot of women hanging out, guys hanging out, me talking like the white guy, and so on and so forth. So that's what was for black people. Now, what I realized later, once when I flew out of Chicago, I realized this is only 6 blocks from the beach. This is too valuable. This property is too valuable for warehousing Negroes. And so what they did is they changed basically to the Section 8 house was the place where people put in welfare. And ironically, a lot of these Section 8 houses are first generation suburbs. So the first generation suburbs that were for the white people are now been shifted around because the white people are sick of driving in, spending 7 hours a day in traffic, driving back and forth to Barrington Hills. They want to live right near the loop. They want to live near the beach. So you had this big sort of the exact opposite of what happened in the 50s then happened in the 90s and the early 21st century in Chicago, where the rich folk, the folk could afford the McMansion, didn't want it anymore, and moved back into the city
Hmm.
because city property is intrinsically valuable and suburban property is not.
Hmm. Um, this process of suburbanization, there is if I may read a part of your book, because it kind of encapsulates the whole desolate world of suburbia. I'm going to quote from the paragraph. So it starts. You're talking about Robert Moses and transportation in New York City, but you kind of describe the desolate world of suburbia and how this sort of insidious plan, how it played out. Because I witnessed it too when I was growing up in the suburbs, in affluent suburbs. Um, I'm going to read the. Just bear with me. I'll read the paragraph, and it's wonderfully written. To cite the most obvious example of how transportation policies affected income, when Robert Moses came to power, New York City had the best subway system in the world, and it cost a nickel to ride on it. By the time he fell from power, it cost 20 times that amount to ride on one of the worst subway systems in the world. But the most significant fact about that period of time is the number of people who stopped riding the subway and switched to the car as their way to get to work. A car costs an average of $6,000 a year to maintain. That fact, coupled with the fact that houses in the suburbs invariably cost more than houses in ethnic neighborhoods in the city, and the fact that wages have stopped going up in this country in 1973, it's an important point, by the way, there's reasons for that, had forced millions of women into the job market, so that the families with two wage earners, and perhaps the kids working at child labor mills like fast food restaurants, can earn what dad alone could do on his wage before, which is to say, raise a family with mom at home to run the household. Now, this is the kicker, what I like. The cost of the car in the house and in the suburbs is enough to drive mom out of the house, and with mom out of the home, the kids came home after school to watch MTV. With mom out of the home, the vampire TV culture has a free hand in forming the minds of the young, telling them how to spend their money in the best interest of the people who advertise on MTV. Congratulations, Michael Jones. It's a wonderful paragraph.
Thank you. Thank
But
you.
that encapsulated the whole kind of how it's played out so far. Um, but now suburbia is on, like as you have alluded to, suburbia is now being targeted because as the American economy has been deindustrialized, the jobs aren't there to support the middle class incomes. And you mentioned now suburbia is now being integrated or being targeted for the social engineering scheme with Section 8 housing.
Yeah.
Um, I just thought that when reading this book, like, wow, that's kind of like the whole plan is laid out before me in its insidiousness. But there it is. I witnessed it myself growing up, with kids coming home watching TV, empty house, big house, just imbibing all that culture.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, it's two separate books. It's
yeah,
Libido, Dominandi, and it's Slaughter Cities, but we're talking about one process
hmm,
because basically what happened during this time was the sexualization of young people as well. Largely, I mean, MTV is a paradigm of this type of sexualization. It's the same thing I talked about with Hollywood movies. It's the same people who are running it, the same goal in mind, the same. It's basically two sides of the same social engineering coin:
hmm,
sexual liberation and suburbs. They're both part of the same agenda.
hmm. And of course, if you get these kids, particularly they do this in college, but now it's even younger, even in the grade schools now. But really, college is when the kids go off supposedly independent, but they're not. They're living off their parents' money or loans that they can never pay back because there's no jobs for them when they graduate anymore. But needless to say, during that time period, they're partying. They're not really studying anymore because they've dumbed down the university so much. But they're taking in all this stuff, and if you get these young people to lose their inhibitions and behave a certain way, it changes their values. Correct? I mean,
That's right.
and they become sort of what you would call it earlier, it's kind of a lumpen proletariat of the sexual revolution.
Well, they now I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't
Okay.
use the word lumpen proletariat because they're criminals and they don't like criminals. You can't have criminals being running your accounting firm.
I see.
You have to have you want what you want is like what Notre Dame and St. Mary's produce. They're like sexual robots and
Okay.
wage
Yeah.
slaves. In other words, people who have no ideas whatsoever. If they had any ideas when they entered places like Notre Dame and St. Mary's, they've lost their ability to think by the time they leave. And so all they can do is accept the narrative as it's given to them and make sure they add up the figures correct. And that's pretty much it. So you don't. I would not use the term lumpen
Okay.
proletariat. That was what the black people were in the ghetto, But that's not. They're not the people. You can't. They don't do anything. They're worthless. I mean, I'm not talking about as human beings, but I'm talking as employees. They're worthless. They can't do anything. They can't get their own lives together. But all they can do is engage in criminal activity, and that becomes then their raison d'etre at a certain point. And now, also, I have to say that at a certain point, the government decides, well, we've had enough of this, and they go in and kill them all, which is what happened in Chicago in '69 when the police went in and killed the Black Panthers. You're seeing the same thing now in the Middle East. Basically, ISIS is another proxy black op, proxy warriors that were created for a specific purpose. They get out of control, and now they start to kill the very people that they promoted.
Hmm.
Osama bin Laden was one of these people. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where this whole thing began. So I'm saying this is part of the situation.
These are
Or
assets in a strategy of tension
yeah,
to manipulate. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and it always. So there's a guy, Liddell Hart, wrote a book on this. A British guy talked about how it began in Spain when the British tried to drive Napoleon out of Spain by creating irregular warriors known as guerrillas or guerrillas, and it always gets out of control. So in America, it got out of control. It still gets out of control. What do you think Ferguson is? What do you think Baltimore is? It's basically a group of people that have been raised to be revolutionaries. All you learn when you go to public school is Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, which means that you're there to defy the law. So surprise, surprise, they feel that the cops, even when they're black, are oppressing them, and they rise up periodically. You know, so this is the legacy of the civil rights movement, which was in many ways a black operation condoned by the government for a specific form of social engineering.
And it was what it did was the powers that be uh, were able to step in and exploit the legitimate grievances that many blacks had at that
Yeah,
time.
I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not blaming blacks. They didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
Nobody knew what was going on at this point. And at a certain point, all the blacks got tired of it, and that happened in 1967. 67. Harold Cruz, a professor of black studies at University of Michigan, writes a book called "The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual," in which he recounts his experience as a communist in Harlem. And he says basically the Jews used us. So for 70 years, the Jews, through organs like the NAACP, were trying to turn the blacks in this country into revolutionaries. Then they succeeded finally with groups like the Black Panthers, which was a total Jewish creation. Ask David Horowitz about that. He was the guy who was the fundraiser for them, the famous neoconservative Israel lobby guy now. They succeeded in creating these black revolutionaries, and then the establishment says, well, we've had enough, and they go in and kill them. And that was the end of the Black Panthers. Now, that was 1969. 69 is the year of the Stonewall riots. So guess who the new revolutionary avant-garde is? Also supported by the Jews. Who is it?
I would say the homosexuals.
The homosexuals, of course it is. The homosexual movement is the successor to the civil rights movement. Of course, there was a little interim called the feminist movement, but that was a black operation too, simply to double the workforce and drive down wages. So now you have the homosexual as the avant-garde, also run by the Jews. We have Vice President Joe Biden to thank for that. He gave a speech to a number of Jewish organizations in which he thanked them for being behind gay marriage. It was embarrassing to the Jews, but Joe Biden said it, so therefore it's not anti-Semitic to say that the Jews are behind gay marriage, because Joe Biden said it, and he should know. He's vice president of the United States.
And it's no surprise that people like Alfred Kinsey were promoted by the foundations and the
yes. Now
agencies.
Kinsey is Kinsey. We're going back to when there was a WASP ruling class,
yeah.
And they got behind Kinsey. I'm talking specifically about the Rockefeller family. The Rockefeller Foundation created Kinsey. There's no doubt about this whatsoever. No doubt. Kinsey used the Rockefellers as his as testimony for his legitimacy. He was a totally illegitimate operative, totally bogus. Abraham Maslow pointed out the flaws in his statistical gathering. The samples were totally skewed. It made no sense whatsoever. But the WASP ruling class was behind him 100%. So I'm talking not just about the Rockefellers. I'm talking about Time Life, Time Magazine, putting him on the cover of Time Magazine in the early 50s, I believe.
And that's Henry Luce, Time Life.
Henry Luce, Time Life, and
CIA.
the CIA. Basically, they're all the same operation.
And
okay, and the link between Luce, between Time and the CIA is C.D. Jackson.
And Time Life. I'm sorry.
We talk about C.D. Jackson in our forthcoming book by Dave Wemhoff on John Courtney Murray, Time Life, and the CIA.
And he was the author of that recent article in February in Culture Wars, correct?
Absolutely, that's right.
Yeah. And
so this is an important part of recent intellectual history in the United States.
When is that book due out?
It'll be out in September.
Okay, exciting. That's when I heard that book was coming out, I was like, that's something I got to get into. That's very interesting because the whole Time Life empire was sort of like created to sell the American century to the American public.
That's right. It was his idea, and he was prescient enough to see that World War II was going to lead to American hegemony over the entire world, except for communism. Mm-hmm. And so they created the anti-communist crusade as a way of consolidating their power in the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. So that in many ways has not changed. Now, with the fall of communism, we're now on the verge. We're in a very dangerous period, verge of World War III or IV, whatever you want to call it, with Russia. They're rattling sabers, talking about using nuclear weapons. The United States is talking about using nuclear weapons. This is a very dangerous period, but it shows you the malevolent nature of this American empire.
You made a point. I think you've made a point in Libido Dominandi that the importance of pornography or sexual morality is that changing morality is sort of a pre-political act. It enables you to control the culture, and once you control the culture, the political control falls into your lap.
That's right.
Yeah, and so with the sexual revolution, and we saw this. This was talked about or written about by Wilhelm Reich, who saw I think you've phrased it in a way, the sexual constitution is crucial to the political constitution.
Yes.
Can you discuss Wilhelm Reich and his role in all of this?
Yeah, he's one of the absolutely crucial figures in the history of sexual liberation as a form of political control. He's right up there with the Marquis de Sade, who was probably the founding father of this whole idea. But Wilhelm Reich was a Jew. He was a communist and a Freudian psychoanalyst living in Vienna. Came to prominence in the 1930s, and during this time, he was trying to. First of all, he's engaged in a cultural warfare with the Catholics. The Jews are powerful in Vienna. The Catholics are powerful in the countryside of Austria, and they are battling over who's going to control the culture. And so in order to win this battle, he's trying to convert everyone to communism, but he realizes that it's hard to get people enthused about communism. But he realized as well, if he ever talked about sex, he always had a big crowd. So he realized that sex was a good way of attracting attention. And not only that, he started to develop this whole theory of how sex could be used politically. And the book is called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. It came out in 1933. And basically he said that either you pray or you masturbate, but you don't do both. And so if you spread masturbation, you will kill prayer. And so he said it's pointless to debate the existence of God with a seminarian, let's say a Catholic seminarian. All you have to do is get him involved in sexual activity, and the idea of God, by which I mean illicit sexual activity. Obviously, I'm not talking about marriage. But all you have to do is get him involved in illicit sexual activity, and the idea of God will evaporate from his mind. Well, guess what? This is what actually happened. Reich appears on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in 1970. This is the aftermath of the Revolution of '68 in Paris, and so on and so forth. And what you see during this period of time is a tremendous sexualization of the American clergy. Notre Dame was instrumental in sexualizing American clergy during this period of time, late 60s, through its summer program, where basically nuns and priests would get together and they'd fall in love and they'd run off and get married. Now, there are some people who are not heterosexual. They have different inclinations. And these people went on to become the real plague in the Catholic Church, the homosexuals, because they felt no desire to leave. Why should they leave? They don't want to start a family. They're not interested in that kind of stuff. There's no clear dividing line between sexual activity between adults and adolescents. There's no big bell that goes off. These people are probably more attracted to younger people because younger people are more attractive. Let's face it. You know, when you're 18 years old or 17, you're more attractive than when you're 96. Okay? So huge numbers of clergy succumb to this, and then we have and of course, they're being cheered on by the media as the new wave of priests. You know, they're in Boston. I forget the guy, Goen, I think. Anyway, the Boston Globe was cheering this guy on. And then, of course, it finds out that he was molesting children. And so, therefore, the same society that cheered him on now comes down on the church like a ton of bricks. And the church is basically almost destroyed by lawsuits. So you see here, and of course, the place where this happened even worse than the United States is, of course, Ireland, where they had a catastrophic sexual molestation problem, which was then used by the enemies of the church to destroy the political influence of the church. And the net result is this referendum on gay marriage, where the Irish who survived the potato famine have now all drunk the Kool-Aid or taken the soup of secularism.
By undermining the church's credibility within the community, you left these people without a parish, without a priest, then they're an easy mark from that point on.
That's right. Yeah. And so exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. At the same time the sexualization of the clergy is going on, we're having the breaking up of Catholic neighborhoods. So it's a miracle that the church survived at all during this period because of the vicious and covert nature of the campaign that was waged against it at this period. Mm-hmm. And I would say the majority of Catholics still don't know what happened. They still don't know what happened. And the official gatekeepers, the Catholic professors, with their Catholic inferiority complex, are making sure they never learn. A professor at Catholic reviewed my book, Slaughter of Cities, for the Catholic Historical Society, and said I made it all up. didn't mention one name that I mentioned, didn't mention Louis Wirth, didn't mention anybody. So gave the impression I just made that all up, that I didn't go to the University of Chicago archives, which are clearly cited throughout all those archives. So no wonder Catholics are stupid.
And you also mentioned in Libido Dominandi this case of the Immaculate Heart Order in California,
Right.
L.A.,
Right.
and what you suggested in there, which I thought was fascinating and also chilling, was that this was a kind of an indirect attack on the Catholic school system by undermining the holy orders, which ordinarily staff the schools. You undermine the economic foundation for the Catholic school system.
Sure.
Yeah, and that was was it Carl
If you don't,
Rogers?
yeah, Carl Rogers.
Yeah.
When Fidelity Culture Shield used to be called Fidelity, and we are the first to break this story. Bill Colson worked for Carl Rogers. He wrote the story of how he worked to destroy the Immaculate Heart nuns in Los Angeles in the wake of Vatican II. This was concrete aggiornamento. After Vatican II, the nuns needed to be updated, and so all of the people who hated the Catholic Church stepped forward, and they destroyed them as part of their updating. And that story is like the classic example of what I'm talking about. It's gone on to be a part of the lingua franca now. Now people know about it in the same way they know about the real Hesburgh now. So yeah, that's an important story.
And these are classic cultural Marxist techniques, correct?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to let people off the hook by saying that it's Marxism. First of all, Carl Rogers was not a Marxist. He was one of the paradigms of third wave philosophy. He was a Protestant. So Marxism was Jewish at this point. This is the time of the WASP ruling class. The Protestants hated Catholics centuries before before Karl Marx was born. And so you have to keep straight the period of time you're talking about and who the main protagonists are, because it depends on the time in history, whether it's predominantly a Catholic, Protestant assault, or whether it's primarily a Jewish assault. Birth control was a Protestant crusade. Pornography was always Jewish. These are just distinctions you have to keep in mind.
Interesting. And if you look at it, in each case, you have the promotion of Wilhelm Reich in 1970, who was already dead by a decade by then, right? Or more than a decade.
Yeah, he died in prison. He became. I personally think that Wilhelm Reich had syphilis, and I think he had tertiary syphilis. It went to his brain because he had all the symptoms like delusions of grandeur, paranoia. He felt that he was paranoid. Obviously, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you.
Yeah.
Obviously, the government was out to get him for some reason or other, and they threw him in jail because of his orgone boxes. But he felt that Eisenhower was trying to rescue him by sending planes over. He was just kind of gone at the end. But we're not talking about that Wilhelm Reich. We're talking about the Wilhelm Reich of 1933. So he's the crucial guy.
So 40 years later, Time Life, Henry Luce, CIA, is promoting him at the same time.
No, I didn't say Time Life. No, Time Life never promoted him. I said the New York Times promoted him.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
The New York Times put him on the cover of its Sunday magazine.
Okay, that was okay. I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. But either way, the establishment media is promoting him. And of course, this is the late 60s, 1970s, and you have the counterculture, which other researchers have done and found that much of this counterculture was manipulated or concocted for the very purposes that you're citing here. For a psychological warfare.
Yeah, I think it was.
And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dave McGowan and some of the music and their connections to military and intelligence. How this looked.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story about
isn't that? Yeah.
Laurel Canyon and all these guys.
And this is where I'm talking how it overlaps with your research. This is why I found your work so fascinating, because you're all coming from different directions. Jan Irvin over at Gnostic Media has kind of like built on McGowan's research and went deeper into it and found the whole promotion of LSD with Wasson and J.P. Morgan Bank and the Century Club and Alan Dulles and the MK Ultra. So all this.
Yeah, there's no question that MK Ultra and the Time Life was heavily involved in the LSD story.
Mm-hmm.
Time Life. I remember as a 17-year-old looking at this weird story about LSD in California.
And the mushroom, yeah.
Yeah, and Leary, obviously, Timothy Leary worked for the CIA. He ended his life saying, "I never stopped working for the CIA." Uh, Claire Booth Luce's wife, took LSD. John Courtney Murray took LSD. Cary Grant took LSD. Everybody was taking this at this time, and it became basically a way of destroying the counterculture with the Grateful Dead. When Owsley started using the Grateful Dead as a distribution circuit for LSD, I think uh, what happened at this point is that there was a legitimate, genuine grassroots youth movement of my generation, the baby boomer generation, who were tired of social engineering, didn't understand what it was. It started at places like Berkeley, University of California, and then the government stepped in with sex, drugs, and rock and roll to destroy it. And they did. They succeeded. The same thing happened in Germany around the same, a little bit later, to deal with the Baader-Meinhof gang. First, you had the sexualization of German culture around 1973, and when that didn't work, places like Berlin were flooded with heroin. 1976, 77. One of the people that has heard this talk that I've talked about, the Israeli pornography talk, was involved in the invasion of Panama, 1989, with George Bush. I remember the news stories at that point. It was all, they were playing rock music to get Noriega out of his house. Well, what he told me, he was there, they were broadcasting pornography too. Well, how come that didn't make it into the news accounts? How come that didn't come? Well, because that's the sign that it's covert warfare. Pornography was used in 74 to overturn the communist government in Portugal. Iraq, after 2003, after the American invasion, Iraq is flooded with pornography. It's too obvious to ignore now. This story is out. And I think that once the story gets out, anybody in his right mind can see that sexual liberation is a form of political control.
Fascinating. And of course, your novel Ratcatcher is about Germany in the 70s, correct?
That's right. And I'm
Yeah.
trying to write a sequel to the Ratcatcher. So the Ratcatcher is about the sex part, and the second volume is going to be about the drug part.
Well, I said it before that culture is very important, and it's so important, whether it's music, entertainment, literature. The powers that be aren't going to take a laissez-faire approach to it. They're going to manipulate it,
No.
right? And so it's naive to think that these things are going to be allowed to develop in a way that maybe challenge the status quo or challenge the powers that be.
I think this is the main service that the useful idiots who are the libertarians provide for the regime. They give you this illusion that it's just market forces. No, I'm sorry, it's not just market forces. The powerful control the market, and they are the ones who create these cultural outcomes. So, sorry, it's not true.
And what little time you have remaining, you have a new book out that I haven't yet purchased, but I want to purchase because I find it. I've heard you talk about it, and it is. You present a very complex, very multi-layered history of economics in this book, from what I can tell.
Yes.
Barren metal.
Yes.
And want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, the initial impetus was me going to Occupy Wall Street, the demonstrations there in New York City and Manhattan. And there, I heard all of the demonization that Bill Riley was engaged in. These are terrorists. We even had a movie where Batman was beating up the Occupy Wall Street movie. So when you get there, it's people who are my children's age, my younger children, people in their 20s who are loaded down with debt and can't get a job. And they're holding little signs saying, I'm $30,000 in debt, or $70,000 or $90,000, and all I can get is an unpaid internship. And so it was this point I realized that what we're talking about here is the two fundamental issues of the economy, namely debt or labor. And so this history, Barren Metal, is a history of basically the conflict between labor and usury about which group is going to control the economy. Aristotle said that money was sterile. In other words, it can't do anything. The only thing that can do something is labor. But that's not the Jewish view. That's not the usurer view. Shylock in The Merchant of Venice tells Antonio, when he's lending him money, my ducats can copulate faster than Laban's ewes and rams. So that's the conflict. And we have clearly in the United States, as in basically every Western power for the past few centuries, eventually you have the triumph of usury, and that means the end of your culture. You know, once you get into finance and usury, once you destroy labor, your culture is going to go down the drain. And that's where we are right now.
And would you say the source of this problem would be the fractional reserve banking system, and the idea they can print fiat money and then
The
loan
source,
it out?
no, the source of the problem is usury.
Yeah.
One of the problems you have to deal with is people always confusing things with sins. Things are not sins.
Mm-hmm.
So the Marxist interpretation of money is that money does this and money does that. No, money doesn't do anything. It doesn't even copulate. It's usury that's the problem. It's not money that's the problem. It's not the problem of paper money as opposed to gold money or the gold standard or anything like that. The problem is usury. The problem is always moral. There's a moral problem here. And the whole point of the English ideology, beginning with Newton, is to claim that morality is not needed in the economy. This is what our libertarian friends are always telling us, and it is completely 100% wrong. We always need moral intervention into the economy because otherwise the usurers take over and they destroy everything, which is what we're close to right now. So we had with the Jewish culture we had beginning in the 1970s, 1999, we have the three Jewish geniuses appearing on the cover of Time magazine, Alan Greenspan, Larry Summers, and is it Rubin? Yeah, Robert Rubin.
Robert Rubin, yeah.
Who are saying all we need to do is repeal Glass-Steagall and paradise will appear on Earth. Well, guess what happened? It didn't happen, and we've had a mess ever since. 2008 was a direct result of the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And so what you're saying here is, no, it's never changed. Economics was and will always remain moral philosophy. It's not physics, it's moral philosophy. And until we get back to that, we're never going to deal with issues like usury.
Yeah, I think Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers were called the committee that saved the world, the committee to save the world.
Thank you.
I think that's what it was. I remember that. That was Time magazine, right?
So yeah, it must be true. It must be true if they're on the cover of Time magazine.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on tonight. It was great. I knew it would be, and I wasn't disappointed. Again, it's Dr. Michael Jones. He is the editor of Culture Wars magazine, author of several books.
And all the books are available at culturewars.com or on Amazon.
And they're real books. I mean, you're talking anywhere between 700 and 1,200 pages, right?
No, 14. Baron Metal's 1,400 pages.
Yeah. So it's a real investment, but it's quite a trip. And again, I'm halfway into not halfway, but a third way into Slaughter of Cities. Finished Libido Dominandi, and I'm looking at your other book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. Waiting to get into that later on this summer if I can keep my reading schedule. Fascinating books, challenging, and they're everything what they're made out to be. Because again, you really get a perspective that you don't get anywhere else, and it's an important perspective. I wanted to ask you real quickly before I let you go tonight. Hello?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Here. Yeah, I just want to ask you, this is part of your intellectual journey. I don't remember, I might be misremembering this, if that's a word. I'm not remembering it properly. But when I read Dionys' Degenerate Moderns a while back, the basic idea behind that book, or your thesis in that book, is that people like Margaret Mead and Kinsey were looking to rationalize their own degenerate lifestyle by covering themselves in anthropology and science. And
right.
It was just basically them trying to justify themselves. But it seems with your subsequent research, you've tended to develop a theory that it wasn't just they themselves trying to rationalize their own behavior being promoted by other degenerates within the establishment. There was a plan here. Is that a development you came up later or something you believed back then?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I did start off with individuals, and those books were about the individual motivation to do this kind of stuff, and I think that's still valid. Okay. I think that these people have their own conscience. They have to deal with their own conscience, and this is how they deal with it. But what I left out, although I didn't really leave it out of the Kinsey thing, was that there are powerful forces who pick up these people and promote them. And so the classic example would be Kinsey with the Rockefellers giving him money and Time Life putting him on the cover of Time magazine. So you can't really have. It's not that Kinsey was a great thinker or anything like that. He came up with an idea that was promoted. He had his own personal compulsions. He was a homosexual. He wanted to justify homosexuality, but it was the Rockefellers in Time Life that made him.
He wasn't just a homosexual; he was also a pedophile.
Well, you have to talk to Judith Reisman about that.
Yeah, yeah, she's done. Yeah, and also same with Margaret Mead, where her book about Samoa and all that. That's produced. That's just there to justify sexual liberation.
Yeah, that's
And,
exactly what it was.
and I think,
She had committed adultery, and then she goes off to Samoa, and lo and behold, the Samoans justify her behavior.
and
I
wasn't her,
call it I call it Blue Lagoon anthropology.
and wasn't her husband Gregory Bateson, who was CIA?
Yeah,
So there
yeah,
you
they
go.
were all involved in this.
Yeah, so make all those connections. Well, listen, thank you for coming on tonight. This is great. Like to have you back sometime when you know in the future, whenever you have the time. I'll just send you a note. If you don't, that's fine, but I'll send you a note. It was great because there's a lot to talk to you about. You've done a lot of work. And there's a lot more. Maybe as I get further into these books, we'll carry on the conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
You're welcome.